everyone, welcome to ArtBookNook, where I share my wonderful collection of art and craft books. Today I'm going to look at Painting Landscapes in Watercolour, Taking Your Art to the Next Level by Oliver Pyle. The book provides a comprehensive masterclass in the art of landscape painting, and whilst it's aimed at those of you with some experience of painting in watercolour, I think beginners will find it interesting and very inspiring as well. Oliver's landscapes are just beautiful. As you can see, this book is presented in an unusual wide landscape format, which is a little different from how most art books are published. So this does make it slightly more challenging to film in close detail. Reproductions of Oliver's paintings are plentiful throughout the book, but they are quite small. And there's also a significant amount of written content, much of it exploring Oliver Pyle's approach to landscape painting. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach with my review this time, focusing on the key ideas from each chapter, which hopefully will give you a much clearer sense of what Oliver's book has to offer. From the outset, Oliver sets this book apart from a typical project-based guide. Rather than focusing on step-by-step demonstrations, he's much more concerned with how we experience the landscape and how those experiences can be translated into thoughtful, well-designed paintings. There's a strong emphasis on working outdoors, sketching on location and then developing those ideas into more resolved pieces back in the studio. Many books will teach you how to paint, but here the focus is very much on the why, with the suggestion that real learning comes from time spent observing the landscape rather than following rigid exercises. Oliver also moves beyond technique, touching on structure, consistency, and even the transition from painting as a hobby into a more professional practice. One of the central ideas running throughout the book is that painting isn't simply about describing what we see, but expressing something that we can't easily put into words. Elements such as edges, transparency, and tonal relationships are treated as essential, not just technically, but as a way of conveying mood and atmosphere. He draws a clear distinction between learning how to paint and learning how to see, cautioning against blindly copying photographs and encouraging a more personal, individual response. So rather than relying on fixed formulas, Oliver's book invites you to spend time in the landscape, observing, sketching, and gradually building a deeper connection with your subject. So why choose watercolour? Oliver is quite clear from the outset that the choice of medium is not the most important decision an artist makes. Having worked in a range of media over time, he settled on watercolour early, drawn to its delicate appearance and the simplicity of the equipment, which makes it particularly suited to painting and sketching outdoors. Watercolour gives Oliver a way to capture subtle gradations in the landscape, unlike any other medium. Its transparency, luminosity and soft transitions lend themselves particularly well to conveying atmosphere and light. At the same time, it's a demanding and often unpredictable medium. Once a mark is made, it can be difficult to change. That lack of control is part of both the challenge and the appeal. Oliver explains that working successfully in watercolour depends on understanding a few key factors, such as timing, the amount of moisture on the paper and the consistency of the paint. But when it comes to developing real control, he's very clear. It comes down to patience and lots of practice. He cautions against quick fix courses that promise you easy professional results, emphasising that real progress takes time. Oliver discusses tonal values, timing and different types of brushwork, but beyond technique, he encourages a more confident and flexible approach, that of knowing when to guide the paint and when to let it do its own thing. Painting outdoors plays a central role in this process. Working on location demands a more immediate response, helping you capture not just what the landscape looks like, but how it feels in the moment. This is where sketching becomes essential. It sharpens your observation, trains the eye, and allows ideas to develop naturally before becoming more resolved paintings. Throughout this section, Oliver returns to a consistent idea. that painting is not about producing a perfect copy of what you see, but about expressing a personal response to the landscape. In that sense, watercolour is less about control and more about your own way of seeing. Oliver's approach to equipment is straightforward. The focus is on finding a simple, reliable setup that suits the way you work, rather than accumulating large amounts of gear. The aim is not to have the perfect kit, but to have one that supports your process, allowing you to work efficiently and stay focused on the landscape itself. This is where watercolour really comes into its own. The minimal setup allows you to respond quickly to changing light and conditions, making it an ideal medium for painting on location. Oliver now expands on how this approach translates into practice, outlining 3 simple ways of working outdoors. The first is a quick sketch setup, a small portable kit designed to capture ideas rapidly. This is about responding in the moment without overthinking. The second is a more considered plein air setup, where there's a little more equipment, allowing for more developed studies while still working directly from the landscape. And finally, for longer walks or more demanding locations, he emphasises keeping things as light and practical as possible, taking only what you need and adapting to the conditions. Across all 3, the message is consistent. Equipment should support the process, not complicate it. Working on location plays a central role here. It encourages a more immediate, instinctive response, helping you to simplify what you see and focus on what really matters. This is where sketching becomes essential. For Oliver, sketching is about training the eye, making multiple sketches, testing ideas and gradually building confidence, learning to observe light, structure and atmosphere, and to record those impressions quickly and honestly. These sketches then become the foundation for more resolved paintings, either developed further on location or back in the studio. And what emerges is a clear process: observe, sketch, develop and refine, grounded in a personal response to the landscape. Section 2. Accepting the challenge. In this part of his book, Oliver moves away from equipment and materials and discusses something he believes is far more important: how a landscape painter actually learns to see. His message is refreshingly blunt. If we want to paint convincing landscapes, we can't simply sit indoors scrolling through Pinterest boards, saving reference photos and hoping somehow inspiration will leap off the screen and onto our watercolour paper. Real landscape painting begins outdoors, but not because every finished painting has to be completed on location, but because being outside trains us in something far more valuable, which is observation. Throughout this chapter, Oliver takes us into the Sussex woodlands, along riverbanks, across Dorset cliffs and into harbours, beaches and the open countryside. And what becomes clear very quickly is that these aren't just pretty places to paint, they're classrooms. Oliver explains that when we paint outdoors, we're absorbing far more than a photograph can ever capture. We notice changing light, shifting weather, the movement of grasses, the coolness of shade, the warmth of reflected sunlight, and perhaps most importantly, space, that sense of distance between ourselves and the landscape. Oliver thinks that serious landscape painters become obsessed. Instead of chasing endless new locations, he returns again and again to the same places: Studland, Kimmeridge, Chichester Harbour, the Sussex Downs, and each visit reveals something new to him. A different tide, a different season, a different mood, and over time those places stop becoming subjects and start becoming familiar companions. From there, this chapter becomes more technical. Oliver breaks down how we create the illusion of depth, using linear and aerial perspective, colour temperature and overlapping shapes. Every principle mentioned is supported by Oliver's own field sketches and finished paintings, which makes the lessons feel grounded in real experience. By the end of this section, the real lesson becomes clear. Landscape painting isn't about finding the perfect scene, it's about learning how to see, and perhaps more importantly, learning what to leave out. So we all need to stop chasing pictures and start building experience. Oliver opens section 3, Understanding the Principles, introducing what he sees as the 3 core foundations of successful landscape painting: colour, contrast and composition. He makes it clear from the outset that these are not isolated techniques, but connected design tools that help transform a competent painting into one with atmosphere, clarity and impact. He begins with colour, and one of the things Oliver stresses is that colour in landscape painting is not simply about painting objects in their expected colours. A field is not always green, a sky not always blue, and a tree trunk is simply not always brown. Instead, Oliver encourages us to study how light, weather, season and atmosphere influence the colours we actually see. Throughout these pages, he repeatedly draws attention to the golden hour, those early morning or late evening moments when sunlight floods the landscape with warm ochres, oranges and subtle pinks, creating the kind of atmosphere watercolour handles really well. He contrasts this with overcast conditions, where colours become softer, cooler and often far more muted. One of the most practical sections here focuses on working with a limited palette, rather than relying on dozens of convenience colours straight out of the tube. Oliver encourages painters to become deeply familiar with just a handful of trusted pigments, particularly the 3 primaries, supported by a few earth colours such as raw sienna or burnt sienna. His argument is that a limited palette not only creates better harmony across a painting, but also helps you to develop your own visual language. He supports this with some excellent mixing charts and swatch studies, showing just how many subtle variations can be achieved from a small selection of colours, but more importantly, he warns against becoming too mechanical with your swatches. The goal, he says, isn't simply to match colours scientifically, it's to build confidence and instinct. Oliver also offers some very honest experience-based advice about the nature of watercolour itself. He reminds us that washes will often dry significantly lighter than they appear when wet, sometimes by as much as 30%, and encourages painters to test mixes before committing them to paper. It's one of those small observations that only really comes from years of practice in the field. Another recurring theme is his avoidance of pre-mixed greens. Instead, he prefers to mix greens from blues, yellows and earth pigments, creating more natural, subtle variations that are better suited to particularly the British landscape. We'll now look at the second of Oliver's 3 core principles, contrast. He makes an interesting comparison, describing contrast almost like music. Just as symphony needs quiet passages and dramatic crescendos, a landscape painting needs variation. Light against dark, soft passages against sharper edges, and quiet areas set against places of stronger detail. He explains that contrast is often what gives a painting its sense of drama and visual clarity. Oliver shows how strong tonal contrast can be used to direct the viewer's eye. The warm glow of the city is balanced against deeper shadow shapes, helping architectural forms emerge with strength and presence. In Evening Light on Cleve Hill and coastal highlights near Kimmeridge, you can see how warm sunlight and cooler shadow areas work together to create depth, atmosphere and a sense of time of day. Oliver also discusses edge control here, how soft blended passages can sit beautifully beside sharper, more defined marks. That idea becomes especially clear in The Seagull's View, Old Harry Rocks, where softer atmospheric passages are contrasted with more structural, carefully defined forms. This is the same painting that's on the front cover of Oliver's beautiful book. Oliver is showing that contrast isn't simply about dark and light. It can be found in colour, texture, subject, atmosphere and even storytelling within a scene. Oliver now describes perhaps the most challenging and sometimes the most important part of landscape painting, composition. In the 2 sketches on the left-hand page, he illustrates how even small adjustments can completely transform a scene. The top sketch does not contain a fence or any cattle. By introducing something as simple as a fence line or repositioning a foreground element, you can create structure, direction and a strong sense of purpose within a painting. On the right, the painting called Wildflowers Durdle Door, your eye is naturally drawn towards the focal point because of supporting movement, shape and tonal structure, which leads the viewer there naturally. Here Oliver explores placement. In the painting shown here, he discusses the familiar rule of thirds, but importantly, he doesn't treat it as a rigid formula. Instead, he encourages artists to see it as a guide, a starting point, rather than a rule that absolutely must always be obeyed. He explains that the position of the horizon can completely change the emotional balance of a painting. A low horizon can celebrate the sky and atmosphere, while a higher horizon brings the attention back to the land, pathways and foreground detail. And here Oliver also begins discussing panoramic formats, those really wide cinematic compositions that suit coastlines, harbours and sweeping landscapes particularly well. Here Oliver has focused on leading the viewer through the paintings. Paths, through lines and subtle directional marks become visual pathways, guiding the eye from foreground to distance. And he reminds us of the idea of simplification, that not every tree, building or branch needs to be painted in full detail. Sometimes the suggestion of a form is far more powerful than describing every element. Roof lines, distant architecture, clusters of trees, even recurring colour notes. The repetition of shapes creates visual rhythm. All of these can unify a composition and create a sense of harmony across the scene, making sure the eye continues to travel through the painting rather than becoming trapped. Here you can see how foreground textures, reflected light and directional marks all help to stitch a scene together. Oliver shares that these paintings feel more like remembered experiences. He talks about painting not just what he saw, but what he remembers feeling. The silence, the early light, and the atmosphere of the place. And in these final pages in this section, Oliver takes us on one of his Dorset field trips, through old barns, coastal paths, abandoned quarries and quiet stretches of shoreline. Here composition becomes less about rules and more about observation, about deciding what matters, what to leave in, and just as importantly, what to leave out. A strong message from Oliver comes through in this section, that composition isn't about arranging objects on paper, it's more about shaping an experience so that the viewer sees the landscape the way you saw it. We now move into section 4, establishing a structure, and for me this is where Oliver's book really begins to show its depth. In these pages he explains that one of the biggest frustrations many landscape painters face isn't necessarily a lack of technique, it's knowing where to begin. You might recognise that feeling, standing in front of a beautiful scene, sketchbook in hand, full of enthusiasm, and then quietly wondering what on earth to do first. Oliver's answered is a structured approach that he calls the 4 Ds: decisions, development, definition and detail. The first stage is decisions. Before any paint touches the paper, he encourages us to ask important questions. What attracted us to this scene in the first place? Is it the light, the atmosphere, the shapes, or perhaps the story? Oliver looks carefully at composition, deciding what to include, what to simplify, and sometimes what to leave out altogether. He also studies the direction of light, colour relationships, tonal contrasts, and even practical questions such as his paper choice and whether the scene requires broad expressive washes or something more controlled. Next comes development. This is where the painting begins to breathe. Large washes are laid down to establish mood, colour, temperature and the overall atmosphere of the piece. Oliver often works with a limited palette here, letting the colours mingle naturally on the paper rather than over-mixing them on the palette. What I particularly appreciate is how Oliver shows unfinished stages of his paintings, those loose, almost abstract beginnings, which can feel slightly terrifying if we're honest, but they form the foundation for everything that follows. Then we move into definition. Here shapes begin to emerge more clearly, edges become important, darks are strengthened, buildings, trees, boats and cliffs begin to take on form. Oliver spends a lot of time discussing lost and found edges, knowing where an edge should disappear softly into the wash and where it needs to be crisp and controlled. This section alone is worth studying. And finally, detail. Perhaps the most reassuring lesson here is that detail isn't about painting every leaf or every blade of grass or every brick. Detail is about emphasis. It's about directing the viewer's eye to the most important parts of the painting while allowing other areas to remain loose and suggestive. Through examples of harbours, barns, coastal scenes and a countryside landscape, Oliver shows us how each stage builds naturally on the last. As we approach the final part of this book, Oliver shifts the conversation away from brushes, pigments and techniques into something many artists wrestle with: what happens when painting becomes more than a hobby? Oliver speaks with refreshing honesty about the realities of building a life around art. He begins by challenging some of the myths that many of us carry. The first is the idea that if you love painting, turning professional must somehow be easy. Oliver explains that while the passion may remain, the relationship with your art will inevitably change when it becomes your livelihood. Deadlines replace casual sketching, galleries expect consistency, customers expect professionalism, and inspiration alone is no longer enough. You also need discipline. I know of one artist, Jenny Gravitt, who actually takes the whole of the summer off just to produce enough work so she can supply the gallery that represents her. Oliver also tackles the idea that self-taught artists are somehow more authentic than those with formal training. His view is simple: collectors rarely buy your qualifications. They buy connection with the piece, emotion, confidence, and the quality of the work itself. Another myth he challenges is the idea that you can simply paint whatever you want and the market will somehow find you. He makes the point that while artistic integrity matters, successful artists also understand their audience. They learn what resonates, what sells, and where their work naturally fits. Oliver talks about testing the market through local exhibitions, building relationships with galleries, and learning how to price your work professionally without undercutting yourself or confusing your buyers. He also stresses the importance of developing your own artistic identity, not by copying trends, not chasing likes, but creating work that becomes recognisably yours. I think this is very poignant. The artists that I admire, I can recognise their work straight away. I know exactly who's painted it. Social media comes under the spotlight too. Rather than treating it as a measure of success, how many likes you've got for a particular painting, Oliver encourages artists to see it as a shop window, one part of a much bigger business. And perhaps most interestingly, he shows how a painting career can grow far beyond simply selling originals, through workshops, demonstrations, writing, licensing and teaching. What I appreciate most about this chapter is that Oliver doesn't romanticise the life of an artist, he respects it. And if you've ever wondered whether your own creative work could become something more, these pages offer not just inspiration, but a roadmap. And with that, the book concludes with a gallery of Oliver Pyle's beautiful paintings. After spending nearly 200 pages sharing his methods, his struggles, his business advice and his philosophy as a working artist, Oliver simply steps back and lets the work speak for itself. What I appreciate here is that Oliver doesn't present these as flawless masterpieces. Instead, many of the captions accompanying the work reveal something more personal. Oliver talks about painting outdoors in bitter spring temperatures while filming tutorials, wrestling with compositions that didn't come easily, revisiting familiar locations again and again, and learning that some of his strongest work came not from forcing a painting, but from observation, patience and persistence. I'm just going to pause here for a moment. This painting is how I first discovered the work of Oliver Pyle. If you're familiar with the dazzling light on a hot summer's day in England, Oliver has absolutely nailed this. This painting took my breath away. I love it so much that I've actually purchased a fine art print of this from fineartamerica.com, and I've put a link in the video description below in case you would like to purchase a print of any of Oliver's beautiful paintings too. Perhaps one of the strongest messages Oliver's book leaves us with is that landscape painting isn't really about producing one perfect painting. It's about returning to places, noticing subtle changes in weather and light, and slowly building a deeper relationship with the subjects that matter to you. By ending with this gallery, Oliver reminds us that technique is only part of the story. What matters just as much is experience, observation, and developing a voice that becomes unmistakably your own. In the appendix, Oliver has listed useful resources for you, such as recommended reading, recommended landscape paintings he admires, and equipment providers. There are also links to Oliver's website and where his tutorial content is available on YouTube, Patreon and Instagram, but I've also linked to those for you below in the description as well. I highly recommend you visit Oliver's YouTube channel. His tutorials are just excellent. So why might you choose to invest in Oliver's book? Well, this is far more than a collection of attractive landscape paintings or technical demonstrations. Oliver shares not only how he paints, but how he has built a life and career around his art, covering everything from observation and technique to galleries, pricing, identity, and finding your own direction as an artist. So if you're serious about developing not just your watercolour skills, but your artistic voice, and perhaps even your own creative business, this is a book that will offer you both inspiration and practical experience from a professional working artist in equal measure. And you'll find links in the description below to where you can buy your own copy. I hope you've enjoyed my review and that you found it helpful. A like or a hype really does help the video to reach other artists who are interested in learning more about watercolour, and it also helps to support the channel too. If you enjoy my quiet exploration of art books, you'll find many more videos here on my channel. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.